Picture a student, hungry, exhausted, drowning in debt, wrestling with a single idea. Some people, he believes, are bound by ordinary rules, and others earn the right to break those rules for the sake of history. Which kind does he think he is? In a cramped, airless attic room in 19th century St. Petersburg, he is about to answer that question, with an axe in his hand. In a few minutes, he will knock on an old pawnbroker's door, and after that, he will never sleep the same way again. The book is Crime and Punishment. Its author once stood before a firing squad himself, pardoned at the very last moment. His name was Fyodor Dostoevsky. Here it is. To understand this novel, you have to understand its author. Fyodor Dostoevsky was born in Moscow in 1821.
As a young man, he trained as a military engineer, but his heart was always in literature, and his first novel, Poor Folk, won him early acclaim. What truly reshaped his life happened in 1849. Dostoevsky belonged to an intellectual circle, the Petrushevsky Circle, that discussed ideas the state considered dangerous. He was arrested and sentenced to death. As the story is often told, he was led out before a firing squad, blindfolded, moments from execution, when a pardon arrived, and his sentence was commuted to hard labor in Siberia. That experience changed him completely. During his years in the Siberian labor camp, the only book he was permitted to keep was a copy of the New Testament, and he read it again and again. When his sentence ended, he still faced several more years of forced military service before he could go home. By the time he returned to St. Petersburg, he was no longer the hopeful young writer he had once been. He had come face to face with the darkest corners of the human mind, and with the psychology of crime and guilt up close. When he wrote Crime and Punishment in 1866, he was under enormous financial pressure from gambling debts, and he published the novel in installments in the literary magazine known as The Russian Messenger. Its first readers followed Raskolnikov's story not all at once, as we do today, but month by month, in growing suspense, waiting to see where his mind would take him next. Letters from this period show that Dostoevsky kept reshaping his hero and his plot, even as installments were already reaching print, deepening the character's inner life draft after draft, which gives the finished novel a sense of having grown and changed even in the writing of it. The novel unfolds in the poorest quarters of St. Petersburg. Rodion Raskolnikov is a former law student, once handsome and promising, now half-starving in a tiny rented room, having eaten almost nothing for weeks. In his mind, a strange theory has taken root. Humanity, he believes, divides into two kinds of people. Ordinary people must obey the law, but extraordinary people, the Napoleons of history, earn the right to break the law in service of some greater purpose. As if to prove which kind he belongs to, Raskolnikov decides to murder a greedy, merciless old pawnbroker named Alyona Ivanovna. But the moment he commits the act, something goes terribly wrong. Her innocent half-sister, Lizaveta, walks in unexpectedly, and she too becomes a victim of the violence. This is really where the novel begins, because Dostoevsky is not interested in the question of who committed the murder. We know that from the very first pages. What interests him is how a person survives afterward, carrying the weight of what he has done. The days following the murder unfold in a haze of fever, paranoia, and a guilt that grows heavier with every page. Watching him, suspecting him, but lacking proof, is the sharp investigating magistrate, Porfiry Petrovich, and the psychological duel between the two of them, conducted almost entirely through conversation rather than confrontation, produces some of the most tense passages in the novel. Porfiry never accuses Raskolnikov outright. Instead, he waits, patiently, for Raskolnikov to give himself away. Around this time, another figure enters Raskolnikov's life, a young woman named Sonia Marmeladova, forced by her family's poverty into prostitution to keep them from starving. In the eyes of society, Sonia is a fallen woman, yet she carries a deep, unshakable faith and an even deeper capacity for compassion. Strangely, It is to her that Raskolnikov opens up, confessing his crime to her before anyone else. Sonia does not judge him. She asks him to accept his suffering and to repent. As the novel progresses, Raskolnikov's theory collapses under its own weight. Rather than proving himself extraordinary, he is crushed by what he has done, cut off from everyone around him, even from his own family. In the end, urged on by Sonia, he turns himself in and is sentenced to exile and hard labor in Siberia. Sonia follows him there. In the novel's final pages, amid the cold of Siberia, something begins slowly to shift in Raskolnikov, and out of the wreckage of his pride and his theory, something like real remorse, and perhaps the first seed of a new life starts to take shape. What makes Crime and Punishment so gripping is not that it tells a story about a murder. It is that it takes you inside a mind. Dostoevsky does not send the reader chasing a detective story mystery. Instead, he places us directly inside a killer's head, and we follow step by step his logic, his fear, and the elaborate ways he deceives himself. That is why the novel is considered one of the forerunners of the modern psychological novel, and even of 20th century existentialist literature. Raskolnikov's theory, the idea that certain people stand above ordinary morality, has resurfaced again and again throughout history in different disguises, and the novel shows with brutal clarity just how dangerous and how corrosive that illusion can be. Debates about crime, punishment, guilt, and justice still return to this book today. And the novel never forgets how poverty itself backs people into corners, how it pushes a society's most vulnerable members toward desperation and toward choices no one should have to make. Sonia's story carries just as much of the novel's moral weight as Raskolnikov's theory does, if not more, and it is arguably the quiet center the whole book turns around. The novel also shows us that crime is not a single act, but an ongoing process, since what truly destroys Raskolnikov is not the fear of being caught, but the relentless, quiet interrogation of his own conscience, which leaves the reader almost as breathless as it leaves him.
A few more details are worth knowing. If you are reading this novel in English, you are, in fact, reading a translation, because Dostoevsky wrote it in Russian, and the English texts now in the public domain rest on translations made in the following decades. From the moment of its publication, Crime and Punishment provoked fierce debate, admired by some and unsettling to others, but it was quickly recognized as one of the towering achievements of Russian literature. In the generations that followed, thinkers from Friedrich Nietzsche to Albert Camus, and from Sigmund Freud to countless novelists after them, openly acknowledged how deeply Dostoevsky's insight into human psychology had shaped their own thinking. The novel has since been translated into more than 100 languages and adapted for stage and screen many times over. Dostoevsky himself was still wrestling with gambling debts while writing it, and under a punishing contract with a publisher, he was forced to write an entirely separate novel at nearly the same time, dictating it at breakneck speed to meet a deadline that would have cost him the rights to his own future work. That he produced a masterpiece like Crime and Punishment under this kind of pressure is on its own a remarkable story worth remembering whenever this novel is discussed. We have covered Crime and Punishment, but living through Raskolnikov's tense, feverish days yourself, page by page, watching his logic unravel from the inside, is an entirely different experience than any summary can offer. If you would like to listen to the complete novel as an audiobook, you will find the link in the description. Subscribe for more books in this series. Until the next one, ask yourself the same question Dostoevsky asked his hero. What rules, if any, do we secretly believe do not apply to us? And what would we become the day we finally acted on that belief, convinced, as Raskolnikov once was, that history itself would forgive us?